I always believed that 23 years of marriage meant something. I believed in the weight of shared mornings, quiet dinners, and the way my husband David would kiss my forehead before leaving for work. I believed in the life we had built together, brick by brick, through career changes, family losses, and the quiet victories that only long-married couples understand. That belief died on a Tuesday afternoon in the sterile hallway of Steady Mary's Hospital, 3 days before my scheduled surgery. 2 tickets to Kenk N on your card, ma'am, the young bank representative had said over the phone, his voice professionally neutral. The transaction went through this morning. Should I flag this as suspicious activity? My hand had tightened around my phone. I was sitting in the preoperative consultation room, wearing the thin hospital gown that made me feel smaller than I already was. The doctor had just finished explaining the risks, the timeline, the possibility that complications could arise. Advanced ovarian surgery was never simple, especially at 51, especially when the masses were as large as mine had grown. No, I had whispered into the phone. Don't flag it, thank you. But something cold had settled in my chest, something that had nothing to do with the fear of going under the knife. David had been acting differently for months. The late meetings that stretched past midnight, the phone calls he took in the garage, the way he would shower immediately after coming home, as if washing away evidence of another life. I had noticed, of course I had noticed, but I had told myself it was work stress, the promotion he had been chasing, the pressure from his new boss. I had told myself many things that, in retrospect, sounded like the desperate whispers of a woman afraid to face the truth. That evening, David had driven me to the hospital for my overnight stay before the morning surgery. He had held my hand in the elevator, kissed my cheek at the nurse's station, and promised to be there when I woke up. I love you, Maggie, he had said, using the nickname he had called me since we were 28 and stupid in love. You're going to be fine. You're the strongest person I know. I had believed him. Even with the cold knowledge of the plane tickets burning in my mind, I had wanted to believe him. I had spent that night awake, not because of surgical anxiety, but because I had started putting pieces together with the cruel clarity that sometimes comes in hospital beds at 3 in the morning. The business trip to Chicago that coincided with my diagnosis. The afternoon when I had called his office and been told he was in meetings all day, only to find a parking receipt from the mall in his jacket pocket. The way he had suggested I not tell my sister about the surgery until after it was over. No point in worrying everyone, he had said. Let's just get through it first. I had thought he was being protective. Now I understood he was being practical. By morning, I had made a decision that would have seemed impossible to me just 48 hours earlier. I was going to find out exactly who my husband had become, and I was going to do it with the methodical precision of a woman who had spent 2 decades managing a household budget and organizing family schedules. The surgery went better than expected. The masses were benign, the procedure straightforward, and my recovery was ahead of schedule. I woke up clear-headed and determined, much to the surprise of my surgical team who had warned me about grogginess and disorientation. David was not there when I opened my eyes. The nurse, a kind woman named Patricia, had smiled sympathetically. He stepped out to make some calls about work, said he'd be right back. I had nodded and asked for my phone. David's phone went straight to voicemail. His office said he had taken emergency leave. His brother, when I called, seemed confused and said David had mentioned I was having some minor outpatient procedure, but nothing serious. That was when I understood the full scope of what my husband had planned. He had expected me not to survive. He had bet on my death, planned around it, and was already living as if it had happened. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was not the hot, explosive anger of sudden betrayal. It was cold, calculating, and absolutely clear. I felt as if I were seeing my life through new eyes, eyes that could finally distinguish between love and performance, between marriage and convenience. I discharged myself that afternoon, against medical advice but with grudging support from my doctor, who recognized the look of a woman who would not be deterred. I drove myself home, moving carefully but steadily, and walked into the house I had called home for 18 years. It was already half empty. The good furniture was gone. my grandmother's china cabinet, the artwork we had collected together. Even my jewelry box from the bedroom dresser had vanished. What remained looked like the skeleton of our life together, picked clean by someone who had been planning this extraction for months. I sat on the bare couch in our empty living room and laughed. It was not a happy sound, but it was genuine. My husband had played a long game, betting on my death and my silence. He had underestimated both my survival and my intelligence. I made my first call to our real estate agent. "Hi, Jennifer. It's Margaret. I understand David put the house on the market. I'd like to know the details." The house had been listed 3 days ago, the day after I had been admitted to the hospital. David had forged my signature on the listing agreement, claiming I was too ill to handle the paperwork myself. The asking price was below market value for a quick sale. There had already been 2 offers. My second call was to our family lawyer. "Tom, I need to understand something about our joint accounts and what happens if one spouse is incapacitated." The lawyer, who had handled our wills and financial planning for over a decade, was clearly uncomfortable. Yes, David had been in touch. Yes, there were provisions for handling affairs if I became unable to make decisions. No, those provisions had not been activated because I was clearly competent and conscious. Has David suggested otherwise? Tom had asked carefully. David has suggested many things, I had replied. I'm beginning to understand how many of them were lies. My third call was to the bank. By the time David's plane was preparing to land in Kankan, I had accepted the higher of the 2 offers on the house, transferred the proceeds to a new account in my name only, and frozen all joint credit cards and accounts. I had also retained a private investigator, a divorce attorney, and a locksmith. I had done all of this from my hospital bed the previous day, working with the focused intensity of a woman who had suddenly understood that my life depended on my next moves. David called me that evening from the resort, his voice artificially bright and loving. "Maggie, sweetheart, how are you feeling? I'm so sorry I couldn't be there when you woke up. There was an emergency at the office, and I had to fly out to handle a client crisis. But I'll be back tomorrow, and I'll take such good care of you." I listened to his performance with something approaching admiration. He was good at this. 23 years of practice had made him very good. "That's sweet of you, David," I said evenly. "Take your time. I'm feeling much better than anyone expected." I could hear beach sounds in the background. Laughter. A woman's voice calling for another drink. "Where are you staying?" I asked conversationally. "The Marriott downtown," David said without hesitation. "Pretty grim, but it's close to the client's office. I had already seen the resort charges on our credit card before I froze the accounts. The Grand Fiesta Americana, Ocean View Suite, couples massage, dinner for 2 at the beachfront restaurant." "Well, enjoy your work trip," I said. "I'll be here when you get back. I love you, Maggie." "I know you do." But love, I had learned, was not the same thing as loyalty. It was not the same as honesty. It was not the same as commitment. David loved me the way someone loves a comfortable chair or a reliable car. He loved the service I provided, the life I had built around him, the way I had made everything easy for him for over 2 decades. He loved my utility, but he had never loved me enough to consider me worthy of truth. The next morning, I drove to David's office. I had never been there without calling first, had never been the suspicious wife who showed up unannounced. But I was no longer the wife I had been a week ago. David's assistant, Rebecca, looked genuinely surprised to see me. "Mrs. Hamilton, I thought you were in the hospital. David said you were having serious surgery and might be out of commission for weeks." I recovered quickly. I said, "Is David in?" I wanted to surprise him. Rebecca's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, discomfort, and something that looked like pity. "David is on emergency leave," she said carefully. "He said you needed full-time care and he couldn't predict when he'd be back." I nodded. That was thoughtful of him. "Do you happen to know if he's been working with Linda from accounting on any special projects lately?" The color drained from Rebecca's face. "Mrs. Hamilton," she said quietly, "I think you should sit down. Linda Morrison was 34, divorced, and had been David's assistant before being promoted to the accounting department 6 months earlier. She was pretty in an obvious way, with highlights and manicured nails and the kind of tight skirts that I had stopped wearing when I turned 40. Rebecca, who had clearly been carrying this knowledge like a burden, told me everything. The long lunches, the hotel receipts David had submitted for reimbursements that didn't match any business trips on his calendar. The afternoon when Rebecca had walked into David's office and found Linda sitting on his desk, both of them adjusting their clothing. "I didn't know how to tell you," Rebecca said, tears in her eyes. "I kept hoping it would just end, that he would come to his senses. I've worked for him for 8 years, and I thought I knew what kind of man he was." I patted Rebecca's hand gently. "We all thought we knew what kind of man he was. That's what made him so good at this." From David's office, I called Linda's cell phone. "Linda, this is Margaret Hamilton, David's wife. I understand you're in Cancan with my husband right now." The silence that followed was long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat. I don't know what you're talking about," Linda finally said, but her voice was shaking. "I'm sure this is very confusing for you," I said calmly. "David told you I was dying, didn't he? That's why it was okay to take this trip while I was having surgery. Because I wasn't going to make it anyway." Another silence. "He said you were very sick," Linda whispered. "I was sick. I'm better now. And I'm wondering if you're aware that David has been liquidating our joint assets and putting our house on the market without my knowledge or consent. I'm wondering if you know that he's been forging my signature and telling people I'm incompetent to handle my own affairs." I heard Linda start to cry. "I didn't know," Linda said. "He said you two were separated. He said you were getting divorced, but you were too proud to admit the marriage was over. He said he was waiting until after your surgery to make it official because he didn't want to stress you while you were sick. That was very considerate of him." I said, "Linda, I want you to understand something. David is not the man you think he is. But more importantly, you're not the woman you think you are. A woman who begins a relationship with a married man while his wife is facing surgery has made a choice about who she wants to be in this world. I think you should consider whether that's really who you are." I heard Linda crying harder now. "What are you going to do?" Linda asked. "I'm going to see what kind of man David really is when he's faced with consequences for his choices. You might want to see that too. It could be educational." I hung up and made my next call to the credit card company. "I need to report fraudulent charges on my account," I said. "My estranged husband has been using cards without my authorization." By the time David realized his cards weren't working, I had already begun the process of freezing our joint accounts, filing for emergency spousal support, and having him served with divorce papers. I had also changed the locks on the house and installed a security system. I had done all of this with the same methodical care I had once used to plan his birthday parties and organize his business trips. David called me that evening, and this time his voice held no pretense of affection. "What the hell are you doing, Margaret?" "I'm recovering from surgery," I said pleasantly. "How's your work trip going?" "Cut the shit. You froze the accounts. You canceled my cards. Linda is hysterical. And I'm stuck at this goddamn resort with no way to pay for anything. That sounds inconvenient. This is insane. You can't just cut me off from our money." "Our money?" I asked. "David, you put our house on the market while I was unconscious and started liquidating our assets. You forged my signature and told people I was incompetent. You planned a romantic vacation with your girlfriend while I was facing surgery because you assumed I wouldn't survive to object. I'm not sure you understand what our money means anymore." The silence that followed was different from Linda's stunned quiet. This was the silence of a man calculating his next move. "You don't understand," David said finally. "Linda and it's not what you think. I was going to tell you everything after you recovered. I was trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" "From the truth. From knowing that our marriage has been over for years. From having to face a divorce while you were sick." I felt something shift inside my chest. Not pain exactly, but a kind of settling, as if pieces of myself were finally clicking into place. "You're right," I said. "Our marriage has been over for years. I just didn't realize you had already moved on." "Maggie, listen, no." "David, you listen. You made a bet. You bet that I would die or be too weak to fight back. You bet that I would be grateful for whatever scraps of attention you gave me because I was sick and scared and dependent on you. You bet that I wouldn't have the strength or the intelligence to protect myself." I could hear him breathing. But he didn't interrupt. You lost that bet. And now you're going to learn what it feels like to depend on someone else's kindness. Linda can figure out how to get you home. Or you can call your brother. Or you can figure it out yourself. But you're not my problem anymore, Margaret. Be reasonable. You can't just leave me stranded here. The audacity of this statement, coming from a man who had planned to attend my funeral and console himself with his mistress, was so breathtaking that I actually laughed. David, you left me stranded in a hospital bed while you flew to Mexico with another woman. You left me stranded in a marriage where I was the only person trying to be honest. You left me stranded with cancer scares and surgical risks while you were planning your new life. I think you'll find that being stranded in a luxury resort is considerably more comfortable than being stranded in a marriage with someone who wishes you were dead. I hung up before he could respond. Over the next few days, I learned things about my husband that reframed our entire relationship. The private investigator I had hired worked quickly and thoroughly. David's affair with Linda had been going on for over a year, but Linda was not his first. There had been others, a string of women who had all believed they were special, that they were the reason David was finally ready to leave his wife. The financial records painted an even clearer picture. David had been systematically moving money out of our joint accounts for months. Small amounts that wouldn't be noticed, but that added up to significant theft. He had opened credit cards in both our names without telling me, had taken loans against his retirement account, and had been using my excellent credit to secure financing for purchases I knew nothing about. He had been planning his exit strategy long before my diagnosis. The surgery had simply provided him with the perfect opportunity to accelerate his timeline. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Catherine Chen, reviewed everything with the grim satisfaction of someone who had seen this pattern before. He's been building a case for claiming you're incompetent, Catherine explained. If you had died or been incapacitated by the surgery, he would have had financial power of attorney and could have liquidated everything legally. He's been setting this up for months. But I didn't die, I said. No, you didn't. And now he's in a very difficult position. He's committed several forms of fraud. He's violated fiduciary duty, and he's left a paper trail that shows clear intent to defraud. We can not only protect her assets, we can probably recover damages. I considered this seriously. The money mattered, of course it mattered, but what mattered more was the principle. David had counted on my weakness, my compliance, my willingness to absorb damage rather than fight back. He had built his entire strategy around the assumption that I would be too grateful, too afraid, or too dead to hold him accountable. He had been wrong on all counts. When you've been married to someone for over 2 decades, you get to know them in ways that go beyond surface attraction or compatibility. You know their patterns, their weaknesses, their fears. I knew that David's greatest fear was not financial ruin or social embarrassment. His greatest fear was being seen as pathetic. David had spent our entire marriage crafting an image of himself as successful, desirable, and in control. He drove the right car, wore the right clothes, and made sure everyone knew about his promotion, his bonus, his vacation plans. He needed to be envied, admired, seen as a man who had won at life. My revenge would be to make sure everyone saw exactly what kind of man he really was. I started with his workplace. I had attended David's company functions for years, had smiled and made small talk with his colleagues and their wives. I knew these people, and more importantly, they knew me as the devoted wife who had always supported David's career. I arranged to have lunch with Rebecca, David's assistant, at the restaurant across from their office building. I made sure we sat by the window where David's colleagues would see us, and I made sure Rebecca understood exactly what David had done and how long he had been planning it. Rebecca, who felt genuinely betrayed by a man she had respected and trusted, was more than willing to share the story with others in the office. By the end of the week, everyone at David's company knew that he had tried to steal his wife's assets while she was having cancer surgery, that he had been having affairs for years, and that he was currently stranded in Mexico because his wife had discovered his plan and cut off his access to money. My next stop was our neighborhood. David and I lived in a community where reputation mattered, where people prided themselves on being good neighbors and decent people. I began having coffee with the women I had known for years, sharing my story with the kind of quiet dignity that made it impossible to dismiss as vindictive gossip. These women had seen me struggling with my health, had offered to help with meals and errands during my recovery, had worried about me and prayed for my successful surgery. Learning that David had been planning to abandon me during the most vulnerable time of my life, had been stealing from me and lying to everyone, made them genuinely angry. Word spread quickly through our social circle. David, who had always been seen as a successful, attractive man with a devoted wife, was now seen as a predator who had targeted his own spouse when she was most defenseless. My final move was the most public and the most devastating. I had always been a private person, someone who kept family problems within the family and maintained a dignified silence about personal matters. But David had forfeited his right to my discretion when he had decided to treat our marriage as something that could be liquidated like any other asset. I wrote a letter. It was not angry or emotional. It was clear, factual, and devastating. I detailed exactly what David had done, when he had done it, and how long he had been planning it. I explained how he had used my illness as an opportunity to commit fraud, how he had lied to everyone about my mental competency, and how he had planned to benefit from my death. I sent this letter to David's family, his friends, his professional contacts, and our mutual acquaintances. I posted it on social media, where our adult children, our extended family, and our broader community could read it and understand exactly what kind of man David had revealed himself to be. The response was immediate and overwhelming. David's own brother called me to apologize and to assure me that David would not be welcome at family gatherings until he made amends. David's mother, who had always been cool toward me, called crying and begging my forgiveness for raising a son who could behave so cruelly. Our mutual friends chose sides quickly and decisively. The couples who had socialized with David and me for years made it clear that David was no longer welcome at gatherings, that his behavior was unforgivable, and that they stood with me. Most importantly, our adult children, who had initially been confused and upset about the divorce, read my letter and understood that this was not a case of two people growing apart or falling out of love. This was a case of one person deliberately attempting to destroy another person's life for personal gain. David's daughter called him and told him she was ashamed to share his name. David's son told him that he was not welcome at family events and that any future relationship would depend on David making full restitution to me and publicly acknowledging what he had done wrong. When David finally made it back from Mexico, having borrowed money from Linda's family for plane tickets, he returned to a life that had been systematically dismantled with the same precision he had planned to use on mine. His professional reputation was destroyed. His social connections were severed. His family relationships were damaged, possibly beyond repair. His financial situation was precarious, as my lawyer had frozen assets and was pursuing damages that could take years to resolve. Most importantly, his image of himself as a successful, desirable man who controlled his own destiny had been completely shattered. Everyone who had once envied or admired David now saw him as a cautionary tale, a man who had destroyed a good marriage and a decent life because he was too weak and selfish to be honest about what he wanted. I, meanwhile, had emerged from the experience stronger and clearer than I had been in years. The surgery had been successful, my recovery was complete, and my future was entirely my own to determine. I kept the house, of course. David's forged signatures on the listing agreement had invalidated the sale, and my quick action had prevented any legal complications. I redecorated it exactly as I wanted, without considering David's preferences or opinions for the first time in decades. I also kept most of our joint assets. David's fraudulent activities and attempts to steal from me during my medical crisis had given me legal grounds to claim the majority of our shared wealth. Catherine Chen had been right about the damages, and the settlement left me financially secure while David faced years of debt and legal consequences. But the thing I valued most was something that couldn't be quantified in dollars or legal judgments. I had learned that I was capable of protecting myself, of fighting back, of refusing to be victimized even when I was at my most vulnerable. I had learned that 23 years of marriage to David had not been a waste, because those years had taught me exactly what I would and would not accept in any future relationship. I had learned what real love looked like by finally understanding what it was not. Most importantly, I had learned that survival was not just about living through difficult circumstances. Survival was about refusing to let those circumstances define or diminish me. 6 months after my surgery, I was having coffee with my sister when I reflected on everything that had happened. "Do you ever regret how you handled it?" my sister asked. "Some people might say you were too harsh, that you destroyed his life." I considered this seriously. I had never been a vindictive person, had never taken pleasure in causing pain to others. But I also understood that David's consequences were not the result of my actions, they were the result of his choices. David destroyed his own life, I said finally. I just made sure that everyone could see what he had already done. I made sure that the truth was visible instead of hidden. I took a sip of my coffee and looked out the window at the sunny morning, at the life I was building for myself one day at a time. Besides, I added, he didn't hesitate to destroy mine when he thought I was too weak to stop him. The only difference is that I succeeded. Now I have to ask you something that's been on my mind since all this happened. Put yourself in my shoes for a moment. You're lying in a hospital bed, facing surgery that could go wrong, and you discover your husband has not only planned for your death but is actively celebrating it with another woman. What would you have done in my place? Would you have confronted him immediately, or would you have done what I did and waited to gather evidence? Some people tell me I was too calculated, too cold. They say I should have given him a chance to explain. But here's what I keep coming back to. He had already made his choice. He had already decided I was disposable. I'm curious about something else too. When you think about the people closest to you, the ones you trust with your life, do you really know what they would do if they thought you weren't coming back? It's a terrible question to ask yourself, but maybe it's one we all need to consider. You know what really gets to me? It's not just that David betrayed me. It's that he was so confident I would never fight back. He built his entire plan around the assumption that I would be too weak, too grateful, or too dead to hold him accountable. What does that say about how he saw me for all those years? Sometimes I wonder if I would have had the strength to do what I did if I hadn't been facing my own mortality. There's something about staring death in the face that clarifies everything else. It strips away all the polite pretenses and shows you what really matters. If my story resonates with you, if it makes you think about your own relationships or your own strength, then maybe that's exactly what needed to happen. Maybe we all need to be reminded that we're stronger than we think, that we don't have to accept betrayal with grace, and that sometimes the most loving thing we can do for ourselves is refuse to be diminished by someone else's cruelty. Share this if it moved you. Comment if it made you think. And remember that your own story of survival and dignity is still being written. You have more power than you know.